what I'm going to do is look at both the social and some of the economic aspects, because traditionally they have been linked, and even more so nowadays in the context of fiscal and budgetary policy. I'm also going to say a little bit about the context of the United Kingdom and its renegotiation of the potential renegotiation and referendum on Europe, because it's having, in my view, such a big impact on what's happened, and traditionally the UK has had quite a significant impact on what's happened in Europe. There are slides available. There's also a script, which I'm not necessarily going to stick to the script because it's a bit longer than what I can cover in the time we have available. But both of them are available by, I think, either emailing Fionnuala or indeed emailing myself if you want copies of them. Now, I'm going to start by trying to set the context in terms of why the European Union today became so important in terms of social policy legislation or workers' rights legislation. And for that, and to understand the context of that, you have to go back to the post-Second World War, when the Marshall Plan to put Europe back together again in terms of the devastation. Initially there was what's called the European Economic Committee, which subsequently became the OECD, which was put together to coordinate the process of the Marshall Plan. And what happened then was, because the British were very reluctant to go outside the structure of the Organisation for European Economic Cooperation, which was essentially an intergovernment organisation, it ended up that effectively the French were asked by the Americans to take the lead in Europe in terms of trying to cope with reinvigorating West Germany back into the fold. French, obviously for security reasons, very worried about that. And essentially, Jean Monnet, who was considered to be one of the founding fathers of Europe, persuaded Robert Schuman to make a declaration which would effectively offer the Germans and anybody else in Europe who was prepared to cooperate with it to put the coal and steel industries, which were really the basis of the resources for war, under a high authority, which would lay the foundation for a completely new approach in Europe. And the British stood aside from that, primarily for reasons of sovereignty and not willing to commit to a high authority. Also concerned with the Labour government about having, if you like, the scope for promoting their own economic policies. But they also stood aside then when the six who formed the coal and steel community decided to pursue further integration in 1955. The British also stood aside from that, because essentially the British only wanted a free trade relationship in Europe. They didn't want a customs union. They were concerned about the relationship with the US. They were concerned about retaining imperial preferences under the Commonwealth system, and they didn't see a customs union as the way forward in Europe, and frankly didn't believe that a customs union would likely emerge in Europe or would even sustain itself. And in actual fact, what happened was that the Americans were not prepared to have a free trade arrangement in Europe, because from their point of view, a free trade arrangement was discriminatory against their exports. There was no benefit, compensating benefit from them in terms of that discrimination, whereas a customs union had the potential to move towards political integration, and the Americans were prepared to live with the discrimination that a customs union involved, because they potentially saw a political entity emerging which would be a bulwark against the Soviet threat at the time as they see it. Right? So ironically, the British, in trying to maintain their relationship with the US, which they considered to be a special relationship, ended up in a situation where they stayed outside what emerged in terms of the EC. And at the French insistence, it actually went beyond the customs union into a common market where you had harmonisation of economic, social policies, transport and agriculture policy, also became confidence for the new common market. So it's important in that context to understand why Europe emerged as a social entity, an economic entity, right, rather than the free trade arrangement, which was the preferred British option. And when the British realised that they couldn't stop the customs union, that they couldn't force the EEC to form a free trade relationship with them, which they tried very hard in 1958 to do, they then came to the conclusion that they had no choice but to apply for membership of the EEC. And the myth is that the UK applied for membership on trading grounds in terms of a trade relationship. In actual fact, it applied for membership on political grounds because they knew as the EEC was emerging as an entity in Europe that the Americans would have to deal with, that if they weren't part of that entity as a declining middle rank power, they would lose their political influence globally. So I'll come back to that later on because that's part of what's going on now in terms of the debate in the UK, in terms of the Eurosceptics, considering that we joined a free trade arrangement and suddenly we discovered it's something else. They didn't. They knew what it was and they made a political decision to join and now seem to want to revisit that. So when the Treaty of Rome was signed back in 1957 and the EEC was set up in 1958, you had social policy provisions under Article 117 to Article 112, employment, working conditions, training, social security, health and safety, the right to associate in collective bargaining, and most important of all, even though I haven't put it up on the slide, it's in the speech, right, Article 119, which was equal pay between men and women. Now, a lot of those articles were there not for social policy reasons, they were there because the French were more advanced in terms of social conditions than the likes of the Benelux or Germany or Italy, and they were fearful that the other countries would have a competitive advantage if they didn't insist on the social policy conditions, including equal pay, being included in the Treaty of Rome. Now, it evolved for the European Court of Justice, right, to very much see these in terms of social policy concerns in their own right and not just in terms of economics. In the 1960s, very little progress was made in terms of the social policy provisions of the EEC, other than social security for migrant workers. Very little happened, and we'll see that in a way it's what's been a constant within the European structure is that as economic progress and economic advances come on the table, well then compensatory social policy advances, right, have tended to go hand in hand with that. And you'll see that right through the process of which we're going to talk about tonight. So the next really big advance in Europe was the Hague Summit in '69. De Gaulle, as you know, would have refused British entry on 2 occasions, to both Macmillan and to Wilson in '67. But when de Gaulle left the stage and Pompidou took over, he convened the summit in The Hague in 1969, and 2 of the issues on the table were the European Monetary Union and enlargement to include the UK and Ireland and Denmark and Norway, even though Norway didn't decide to join. Again, in the Paris Summit in 1972, the clear link was made between EMU and social policy. That link between economic and social progress that I've spoken about. So we see then in 1974 the emergence of the first social action programme that had been agreed at the Paris Summit in 1972. And that talked about 3 critical things. Full employment obviously being an important priority at that time, as it is again. Improved working conditions and also social dialogue between the social partners. So you had issues like working hours, holidays, minimum wage, equal pay, health and safety, disability, anti-poverty strategy. All of those issues were set out in the first social action programme in 1974, though it took an awful long time for some of those, to actually make substantial progress. Ireland, as you know, joined in 1973, and one of the first, if you like, indications of the importance of Europe for social policy was when the Commission refused Ireland a derogation on equal pay in 1974, and they had to implement the Equal Pay Act, the directive that was passed in 1974 by the European Union. The marriage bar had to disappear, equal treatment then came through in 1977. So very much in the 70s, equal pay and equal treatment between men and women was some of the core issues that were being, if you like, put on the agenda in terms of Europe. When Jacques Delors then came in as the Commission President in 1985, you had the Single European Act. Again, the link between the single market and the social dimension was made very clearly in that. Two key issues in the Single Act were workers' health and safety and social dialogue. They were the two key advances in social terms under the Act. Qualified majority voting came in so that individual member states couldn't block progress on social policy. And it was actually the beginning of a very intense legislative phase on social policy. A very broad definition was taken of health and safety in terms of not just occupational health and safety, in terms of chemical safety or hygiene or issues like that, but as we see in a moment, issues like working time and working hours and all of that. And the idea was that the single market would be completed in December 1992, but that social policy progress would be made in line with that. Then in 1989 you had the Charter, the first European Charter of the fundamental social rights of workers. That was passed by the Madrid Council of the European Union in June 1989. Then we see the beginning of the UK opt-outs in that. It was passed by 11 of the 12 member states, with Britain refusing to agree to it. But again, as you see, not trying to block it, but effectively trying to opt out of it. That charter was very similar to what we saw in 1974. The agendas and the issues were very, very much the same. Some additions in terms of fair wages, the idea of fair wages, consultation, youth, elderly, the disabled, but the right to collective bargaining included in it. But probably the most important point about the Charter of Social Rights in 1989 was a strong signal that it would be acted on and would be implemented, whereas the 74 Social Action Programme, arguably progress is made in terms of the anti-poverty issues, but a lot of the workers' rights issues didn't really become part of the legislative agenda. And then as part of the Single Act, we had the Delors report on European Monetary Union. Unfortunately, compared to the Werner report of 1970, very, very weak foundations. And in actual fact, in terms of the decision to convene the Intergovernmental Conference on what became the Euro, there was a specific clause in the decision referring to the need for subsidiarity. So that effectively meant that in establishing the Euro, only the minimum was done at central level, the construction and the foundations on which the Euro was built on. We then had the Maastricht Treaty, the social protocol in the Maastricht Treaty, again quite similar to the Charter of Rights, the Social Action Programme, covering the same ground, but this time again the UK opting out. Some years later, incorporated the social programme when the new Labour government came in. The Amsterdam Treaty also extended anti-discrimination legislation to race, disability, ethnicity, age, the 9 grounds as we normally refer to them now in Ireland. And you had the start then as well, following on the Amsterdam Treaty, where the social agenda and the social dialogue that's built into the social agenda allowed for agreements to be made between the social partners, and you, in fairly quick succession, you had agreement on parental leave, agreement on part-time work, and also agreement on temporary contracts or fixed-term work, as it's called, Pregnant Workers Directive, Information and Consultation, the Posted Workers Directive of 1996. So we had a very intense period after the Single European Act, after the Maastricht Treaty, of implementing social policy legislation through European directives. One of the big weaknesses from the Irish point of view was on pensions, because in essence the European development on pensions were covered in the 1990 Pensions Act, but that proved itself to be entirely inadequate, and it took the European Court of Justice in the Watergate Glass case to form the basis for helping to resolve that. You just go back then, in an Irish context, in the 1970s, you'll see equal pay, equal treatment. Transfer of undertakings was also an important directive from the 1970s. Single European Act introduced qualified majority voting in social policy. That made it easier to get it through in terms of member states not being able to block progress, and the UK in particular not being able to block progress. Health and safety, a very wide interpretation, as I said, that allowed the Organisation of Working Time Act to come in under the health and safety provisions of the Single European Act. A very broad way. The UK opposed that. The UK had opted out of the social protocol, and they challenged the Commission in terms of implementing the Organisation of Working Time Act under the Single European Act. They argued that because of the social policy, the social protocol opt-out, that they weren't obliged to go along with the Organisation of Working Time Act, but they lost that, but still managed to negotiate some opt-outs within that. Social dialogue agreements then, in terms of parental leave, part-time work, fixed-term work, they actually have the force of law across the European Union. So it's quite a unique structure in the treaty that the social partners can sit down, make an agreement, and the Council, without amending that agreement, will put that into a directive which then each state has to transpose in its own national legislation. We then have the development of the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, a whole new, if you like, additional social policy development on top of that. Okay, I want to go on now just to cover one of the most controversial issues, I think, in recent times that's emerged in the European Union. And that's been the decision of Laval and Viking at the time, with the trade union movement at European level, trade union movement here having real concerns that strike action in future must be proportionate if they affect the four freedoms. Also concerned that the court might allow lower wage rates for workers from Eastern Europe moving across. 2 was supposed to be a similar proposal. However, it was contradictory in that it interposed, and that the right to strike wasn't going to impact either on the other freedoms. So it was next to useless in my view, and the trade union certainly rightly weren't happy with the Monty II clause, as it was called. And the Parliament yellow card procedure meant that 12 parliaments effectively, which was a new initiative under the Lisbon Treaty, put up the yellow card and effectively it died. The Commission then didn't proceed with the Monty II proposal in that context. So we still need a new initiative, from the Commission, or otherwise we're going to be sorely dependent on the European Court of Justice to eventually find a resolution of that issue. And if you look at it, it is going to be difficult because you have very different traditions in terms of industrial relations systems and the right to strike and all of that. And in general, in Ireland and the UK, well certainly in Ireland anyway, the system is considered to be relatively permissive in that you don't have to exercise proportionality, You sometimes have to make sure you apply the rules, as we saw in the last day or two, But you don't have to exercise proportionality. But it is still an issue that's unresolved and needs to be resolved. I'm going to go on now to the economic issues, very quickly, in terms of what's called the European semester. And I think if you look at the current debate in Ireland, this is actually much more constrained than I think most people realise, in that the combination of the Fiscal Compact Treaty, which in my view was necessary to protect the euro. I don't think the euro could have survived, right, without the Fiscal Compact Treaty being implemented, right? But nonetheless, what we now have is the combination of the Fiscal Compact Treaty, which puts strict limits on your structural deficit, the six-pack regulations and the two-pack regulations. The six-pack regulations covers budget surveillance, excessive deficit procedure, macroeconomic imbalances. It also provides for corrections and fines to be implemented. The two-pack procedure of regulations monitors budgets, and it also covers the post-programme surveillance. So that in essence, fiscal and budgetary policy now, in the main, is centralised, right, under the European semester at Brussels level. And spending is tightly controlled. You cannot exceed, in spending terms, your GDP percentage level, other than through tax increases. Under this two-pack proposal, any country who has been in a programme, which includes Ireland obviously, is under surveillance until 75% of the money is repaid. I'm not quite sure how long that takes here, but it takes quite a long time. Right? So effectively, you don't have the Troika, but you have the Commission and the ECB applying reviews every 6 months until the money is repaid. So the notion that we have had our economic sovereignty restored is a bit of an illusion. Right? Now I say that as someone who recognises, right, that to have a common currency such as the euro, well then you can't have national economic sovereignty in the same way and still have a common currency, right? So but I think as well we have to face up to that fact and debate that fact and not pretend, right, that we still have economic sovereignty in the same way. I mean, national parliaments now effectively can make the decision of exactly what to tax, or exactly what to spend, but within the parameters, and very tight parameters, right, that are set at Brussels level. We've had a huge debate in recent times about austerity not working. And there's no doubt, when you look at the growth rates in the United States, they have exceeded Europe since the crisis began. But you also have to look at the fact, and this is the conundrum we have, Europe doesn't have the fiscal capacity as a federal system that the United States have. I mean, the European budget is 1% of GDP, there or thereabouts, 1.2% or so. Right? The ECB does not have the lender of last resort capacity that the Federal Reserve has. A banking union is now seen as the solution, a kind of a silver bullet. But you also must remember, and you'll have some people saying, well, Europe messed up by creating the euro without a banking union. There wasn't a single central bank governor on the Delors Committee who was even prepared, not a single one, who was even prepared to countenance centralised supervision of banks. And that's a small part of banking union. Not a single central bank governor was prepared to countenance that. Right? And from our point of view, if we had centralised supervision by the ECB of banks, we all know we wouldn't have the crisis. There's no doubt about that. Right? There's also a view, right, that, well, you know, why is Germany not prepared to go the full hog in terms of banking union? Well, now, Germany, we know, has a problem with Eurobonds because it feels it'll be liable for Eurobonds, and it can't be sure that countries like Ireland won't go mad on the property spree, so they're not going to sign up to Eurobonds, right? Well, then you have to ask the question, if they won't sign up to Eurobonds, how could you expect them to sign up to full banking union? Because the liabilities of the banks are 3.5 times European GDP. So if you don't sign up to Eurobonds for sovereign debt, well then you certainly couldn't sign up to full banking union for liabilities that are actually 3.5 times that. So there's a lot of issues within that, right, that I think we need a more clear-cut debate in this country about. And if you go back to the original plan 1970, the Werner Plan on Monetary Union, it envisaged fully centralised fiscal policy and fully centralised economic policy. And the problem is that in a context now, effectively governments are borrowing in a foreign currency. The euro is a foreign currency because the Irish Central Bank can't create the euro. Right? So if you get in trouble with the markets, right, and your bond interest rates go up, you have nowhere to turn, right? Because you can't print the money. So you have the problem that the bond markets were asleep for a decade. Now they're super vigilant in terms of what countries' borrowing rates in the bond market are going to be. The solution can only be more Europe, but the problem is looking for a solution of more Europe currently, when Europe has been brain for the crisis and Europe is at its lowest ebb, right, is a conundrum. And how we resolve that conundrum is really what we have to focus on, in my view. And even the EMU blueprint that Barroso and Van Rompuy have proposed, they're talking about a very, very limited fiscal capacity that essentially would look at covering unemployment insurance type schemes where you had a crisis and unemployment went up. It would certainly help individual countries, but it's unlikely to provide Europe with the type of stimulus that it needs and the type of stimulus that the United States can give. So when you say, as I think it was Fintan O'Toole was contrasting the difference between the United States and Europe in a recent opinion piece in the Irish Times, if you want to be more like Boston rather than Berlin, well then you've got to cede more sovereignty in economic and fiscal matters, right, to the European Union. There's no choice, right? Otherwise you just got to break up the euro, and if you break up the euro, you break up Europe, and we put 50 or 60 years of what's happened behind us. The other issue you see people saying is, well, Germany and creditor countries, right, have to do more in terms of boosting domestic demand. And on the face of it, that looks reasonable, right? It's not the first time it was said. It was actually said and written in the 1972 Paris Summit. It didn't happen, right? So it's not a new idea, right? But I think people who see that as a solution are likely to be disappointed. And the reason I say that is, if you look at when the euro was formed in 1999, France was Germany's biggest export market. China was only 20% of that market. In other words, they sold 5 times more to France than they did to Germany. Now they're almost equal, and China is likely to overtake. So, leaving aside the inflation problem that the Germans would see with boosting domestic demand by too much, right, they're not going to risk their global competitiveness in terms of being an export outside the EU by having an inflationary policy in terms of domestic demand. So there is that conundrum there. You know, we run the risk of sclerosis continuing in Europe unless some bold decisions are made in terms of moving the agenda forward, which in my view, the only solution ultimately will be to go back to the ideas that were there in the 1970s, right? Until free market ideas took over, and recognise that you just got to centralise fiscal capacity and economic capacity more. And probably the only way to get the Germans to boost domestic demand is if the decision has been taken in Brussels, it's not been taken in Berlin. That's probably the reality that we face. And this is where the UK renegotiation comes in, and it's important in my view, because the threat of exit and renegotiation currently is actually stopping decisions being made in Europe, right, in terms of solving the crisis. Right? Whereas people might have gone for a big treaty change, right, and the Germans probably would have pushed it, right? They're being told by the French and others, we won't get it through our constituents, right, our electorates, right? And the UK is having a big influence in terms of that. And outside, you know, and the irony is, the UK believes that fundamental treaty change is needed in the Eurozone to make the Eurozone secure. And they're probably right in that, but it probably won't happen. But outside of major treaty revision, the prospects for repatriation of powers to the UK, in my view, is close to zero. You have the Germans and the Dutch being quite open in terms of what Cameron is saying. Right? We know the French are not, but that was the same in the 50s. Right? The same good cop was France and was Germany and the Netherlands. The bad cop was de Gaulle. It's actually a repeat, right? And the real danger, in my view, is that the UK is actually repeating the same failed strategy, that they had in the 1950s in terms of their attitude to Europe. One concern I would have is that in this refit, as they call it, which is looking at the burden, as they call it, of regulation on small businesses and microfinance, and lessening that burden, which is okay if it's just, you know, excessive red tape that isn't necessary. None of us want to see that, right? But if it led to diluting the policy content of social policy directives and even the directives on part-time work and the directives on fixed-term work that are actually social policy agreements, they're actually being looked at in that context, right? So we need to be very vigilant as a trade union movement in Ireland and elsewhere, not to allow the social policy context of directives to be diluted just to suit the British renegotiation. And you know, the irony is, right, that the British promoted widening to Eastern Europe to avoid the deepening that they feared in terms of what was happening with the Maastricht and Amsterdam treaties. And now, right, you know, they have a problem because of that widening in terms of immigration, right? And it's extraordinary to me that they would call movement within the European Union immigration, right? Immigration to me is something that takes place outside of that, and they're even questioning, and even Ed Miliband is questioning, right, the concept of ever closer union. Interestingly, right, the approach that Thatcher and Major took, because they never wanted to exercise a veto and saying, well, you can have an intergovernmental conference, we can't stop that, but we won't pass any treaty amendments to come out of it, we'll veto them. They never did that, right? They always looked for opt-outs and were successful in getting their opt-outs. Schengen, Justice and Home Affairs, right? Charter of Fundamental Rights. Cameron tried a different policy. He actually tried to exercise a veto, and he failed, right? So I think Thatcher and Major knew that if they tried to veto, then the rest would just move on without them. That's what Cameron discovered. Miliband, you might see, he's had a swipe at the Irish in terms of the reruns of the referendum, saying, well, you know, you shouldn't do that and that's never that. But it's interesting, right, that by saying that, well, if there is treaty change, he's not saying we'll just veto it or try to veto it. He's saying we'll have an in-house referendum. So in essence, I think Miliband has returned to the Thatcher and Major approach, even though it may still inhibit Europe in terms of what it's doing. Just quickly finish up now by saying, I mean, there's an inconsistency between the British looking to have access to a deeper internal market while they have sterling as a currency that can devalue outside the euro. I mean, why would the French or anybody else give them greater access to a bigger market with a currency that can devalue in sense, right, in terms of that? And I think, I mean, the crisis in Ukraine may change this because it shows you the potential dangers that are still there in Europe. And don't forget, within the European Union, there is a Russian enclave called Kaliningrad, right? It actually is an enclave within the European Union, right, between Poland and the Baltic states, right? Russia, Latvia, 40% Russian speakers, right? So, you know, I don't think we should be under any illusions, right? So, you know, you could have, right, a scenario where accidentally, unintentionally, because they can't negotiate any deal of any significance, they almost accidentally exit the EU, or at best, right, if there is a renegotiation of the Eurozone which allows them to go into the outer sphere, right, they've gone completely then against the original idea they joined the European Union for, which was to have political influence, right? And then, in my view, right, they're Switzerland with nukes, as I would call them, right, in terms of that context. So, okay, I've included the British aspect because I think it's important in terms of understanding the whole development. So that's it. Thank you very much.